Buenas tardes. Quiero dar la bienvenida a todos los investigadores de Mindfulness que hoy estamos aquí. Somos personas de más de 30 provincias, de prácticamente todas las comunidades de España, de algún país extranjero, Brasil, etcétera, y que trabajamos en diferentes campos y que representamos todos los niveles de investigación, desde catedráticos hasta becarios, predoctorales. Tenemos la suerte de compartir. Decía que tenemos la suerte de compartir una jornada con Jon Kabat-Zinn, que es el padre del mindfulness y referente en este tema para todos nosotros. Yo quiero agradecerte profundamente, Jon, tu estancia aquí, en Zaragoza, una ciudad modesta, pero que en mindfulness, pues bueno, estamos trabajando desde el Congreso Internacional al Máster. Comentaba que quería agradecerte especialmente tu presencia aquí, el venir hasta aquí y estar con nosotros. Quería agradecer también a Fernando Torrijos. Gracias a él ha sido posible todo esto. Muchas gracias, Fernando. También quería agradecer a los investigadores que estamos aquí, por vuestra presencia, por la posibilidad de compartir conocimientos. Es una ocasión única, en cualquier caso. Y también quería agradecer a mi equipo todo el apoyo que han estado haciendo durante todo este tiempo. Sin ellos nada de esto sería posible. Nuestro equipo, como has visto, son gente joven, son la nueva generación, son el futuro, de alguna forma, de mindfulness. Y nada más, quería agradeceros especialmente vuestra presencia aquí. No tengo palabras realmente para poder agradeceros. Entonces, empezamos cuando quieras, Jon.
So, I'm just really thrilled to be here. And I met some of you at a late lunch that we had. Some of you I know for a long time, and most of you I don't know. So I'm just really happy to be here, and I have to say that in my experience of Spain, I think I landed on Friday, and everything that's unfolded since then has been just a marvelous adventure, and there's a general sense that I'm getting that the level of interest and understanding, embodiment and investigation of mindfulness in this country is unusually widespread and deep. So I will just say this, and then I hope we just have a conversation about it. I have some slides of very recent papers that have been published that I could use as examples of what I find exciting nowadays in the whole field. But I certainly second what you're saying, and have been emphasizing this in my talks, that nowadays we have researchers on both the medicine side and the neuroscience side and the psychology side who started meditating long before they went into medicine or neuroscience or psychology. So there's a kind of convergence in young people of like deep personal interest in liberation and a dynamic, finding some kind of dynamical balance and deep meaning in life, and also investigating how that works at the level of biological mechanisms. And so this is kind of almost like a renaissance in the possibilities of understanding ourselves from a first-person perspective and a third-person perspective. And when we have conversations like this, we bring those together with a second-person perspective, a kind of, the teacher or the meditation instructor discussing experience with the practitioners, and then what that looks like from the point of view of when you put people in fMRI scanners, or you meditate yourself in an fMRI scanner or a quantitative EEG or whatever it is. So it seems to me that in some way or other the Dharma, if you'll excuse my using that kind of terminology, is somehow the Dharma is igniting the potential for a revolution and a renaissance in wisdom and compassion, the likes of which we haven't seen on this planet ever, because we're now talking about something global, not something simply limited to a particular city or institution or university, like, for instance, in Nalanda or something like that. So I did not come here to give a lecture on research in mindfulness because you know much more about it now than I do. I stopped doing research myself 16 years ago when I stepped down from being the director of the Center for Mindfulness and of the MBSR program. So what my job on the planet seems to be nowadays is to support other people, usually younger people, in doing the highest quality research possible, because we have to understand the meditation practice from the inside in order to even ask the right questions that would be tractable but also important enough to ask about what the long-term consequences are of the kind of deep, attentive inquiry and cultivation that mindfulness really is about. And I'll just say this, because you know, it's not actually an accident that the world all of a sudden has caught fire about mindfulness. They're not talking about Dharma. They're not talking about meditation in general. They're not talking about shamatha or any number of other very important domains that they could be talking about. Everybody's got mindfulness on the lips. And I meant that to happen because if you approach Buddhist meditative practices from the point of the, say, the Abhidharma, and you start to divide things into thousands of different categories, in some way that might be very useful for investigators to do at some point and to understand that framework. But from the point of view of bringing this into the mainstream of the world, we really needed to have one overall, overarching umbrella term that would in some sense carry the deep wisdom and the deep structure of the Dharma. And I chose quite instrumentally to call it, to choose to use mindfulness as the term to do that. And there are all sorts of reasons for it which we could discuss. But mindfulness in my vocabulary does not merely mean the one mental factor out of 49 or whatever it is that knows whether the attention is on or not on the object of attention. It's not that. It's a much larger way of languaging the full dimensionality of the Dharma. And you know, nowadays there's a lot more talk about compassion than there used to be in the research field, and there's now what's called mindful self-compassion, for instance, and people are researching that. As if mindfulness itself doesn't have compassion and we need to do compassion over here and mindfulness over here. And I think there are some ways in which that is useful, because there are lots of ways to cultivate compassion that are specific to particular kinds of exercises or meditation practices. We can't put all of those into 8 weeks of MBSR. But to think that there's no compassion in MBSR and you need to have something else that takes care of that side of it, because we only take care of the mind, but we don't take care of the heart. I find myself often reminding people that in all Asian languages virtually, the word for mind and the word for heart is the same word. So if you don't hear heartfulness when you hear in English the word mindfulness, in my view, you're not really understanding what it is that we're even talking about. And there was a very interesting study, speaking of research, by Paul Condon and his colleagues at Northeastern University a while ago. You probably saw it, where they got a Tibetan teacher to actually develop 2 parallel curricula, 8-week curricula. One, mindfulness with no explicit compassion in it. One, cultivating compassion, different meditative practices than the mindfulness piece, no explicit mindfulness in it. And then they did this marvelous test, a real-world test that you probably all know about, where they had each person who was trained in the mindfulness or in the compassion walk into a room with 3 chairs, 2 of which were occupied by people who it turns out were confederates of the researchers. And so there's only one chair to sit down in. That person sits down to wait for being called in for the evaluation. And then another person comes into the room on crutches, obviously in pain, and the two Confederates don't get up. And there's something well-known effect called the bystander effect, where if people are not showing compassion, then you're less likely to show compassion in a particular situation. And so it's a very, I think, stringent behavioral test of whether 8 weeks of mindfulness or 8 weeks of compassion training actually translates into getting up, giving the chair to the person who's in pain. And when they did that study, they found that the subjects on the mindfulness side and the subjects on the compassion side, that was the same proportion of people who got up and gave the chair to the person in pain. So that suggests that there's something interesting and worthy of, I think, more inquiry and study about what it is we think we're doing when we're training somebody in, say, moment-by-moment, non-reactive, non-judgmental attending, and when we're training somebody in loving kindness and a sort of greater sense of trusting one's own impulse to move towards and be of some use in helping carry someone else's suffering. Are these two separate things, or are these different sides of the exact same thing? So these are tractable, I think, research questions, and that particular protocol I thought was really fabulous, because it's not like asking a paper and pencil questionnaire, how compassionate are you now that you've had 8 weeks of mindfulness? Or how mindful are you now that you've had 8 weeks of compassion training? So I don't want to talk anymore. I mean, you've probably gotten the sense that I could talk about this stuff forever. And the reason for that is that I could talk about this stuff forever, although I prefer just that we just practice. So maybe what we should do is think of what I just said as a kind of preamble or introduction. Why don't we drop into silence for at least a few minutes, and then we can have a dialogue. Would that be okay with you? And if you hear all the rearranging, everybody's shifting and sitting up straight and all of that, none of that's necessary. Mindfulness is like, right now, it's not like, oh, let me get ready to be mindful, and then like, yes, I'll be mindful. And now I'm being mindful. You know, it's like there's no separation in reality between mindfulness and everyday life, mindfulness in this moment. We create artificial, you know, and there is a way in which, you know, formal meditation practice, of course, you want to optimize your posture and everything else, but there's a certain orthogonal way of understanding this that means that any moment, any posture, any circumstance is actually perfect for cultivating presence. Open-hearted, open-minded, undistracted, unfabricated, uncontrived wakefulness. It's not something we have to get, it's something we already are, if we can get out of our own way. And then it's always silent. So if your eyes have been closed, seeing if you can invite them to open. And maintaining, as you do that, a seamless continuity in terms of your being present. Or resting, if you will, in what some people call open presence. If you're hearing sounds, then let them be sounds. Let there be the knowing of sound and the silence inside or in between sounds. And for practical purposes, if there's anybody who knows what these sounds are and how to shut them off, that would also be a good idea. But if not, we will, not be disturbed by them. Does anybody know what these are? Does anybody hear them, or am I just the only one that hears them?
I think it's a demonstration. It's a demonstration.
It's a demonstration outside?
Yeah.
Oh, a political demonstration?
No, I think not political, but labor demonstration.
Labor demonstration. Oh, okay. Then let's enjoy it.
Yeah.
Okay. So you've come here for some reason. How many of you come from someplace other than Zaragoza? Okay, so you've had to make a significant effort to get here. Why are you here? And what would be important to have happen in the short time that we have before we have to go to the train station and go to Barcelona that would be worth your having come in the first place?
Excuse me, please.
What, maybe everybody should introduce themselves just in case everybody did.
Thank you very much for coming to Spain, and also thank Fernando, Javier, and all the people who have made it possible that you are here with us. I think it was already high time that you come to Spain.
High time, I agree.
And I am very glad about it, and I think it's a good opportunity for many people to know you personally and to get some, so to say, some flavor of your presence. Well, what I would like to ask you was something in relationship with what you said at the beginning. You said that mindfulness could be an overarching word for something very general, very important, which I completely agree. And then you have mentioned one word, and I would mention another one. And perhaps I would like to listen to your comments on these words. One of them is presence, you have already said, and the other one is consciousness. I think they could also express something similar to mindfulness. I don't want to put mindfulness aside, but just to listen your opinion. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm not an expert on consciousness. I don't even know if there are any experts on consciousness. We have all these different words, and they're different in different languages. So we have in English the word awareness. It's not exactly that kind of word in Spanish, as I understand it. It's not the same as attention. So we grope for ways to, but just because we say awareness in English doesn't mean we know what we're talking about. And I think that it's my understanding that we still don't have any kind of deep biological understanding of sentience, of consciousness, of awareness, of how we get this non-material dimension of living out of 3 pounds of meat in the head, if, as some people speak of it, if indeed it comes from the brain at all. And I know there's a whole philosophical dispute about whether consciousness precedes matter or is other than matter, or whether it's the complexity of the, 200 billion neurons and everything else that's going on in the, not just brain, but the entire body that gives rise to sentience and felt experience. So these are like, in my wildest dreams as a graduate student in my molecular biology, I never thought that science would actually even want to approach these kinds of questions in tractable ways. And now it's happening. And it has profound philosophical implications in terms of like what we're now calling contemplative neuroscience or neurophenomenology, and the kinds of things that Francisco Varela used to talk about and that Michel Pitbull and others do. And this, again, convergence with the deep Dharma that's thousands of years old and that is really not merely Buddhist, but in some sense many different traditions have elements of this, and the convergence of interest in science, and especially young scientists who, as I said before, it's not like meditation's a hot topic, so let's study it. It's like we're meditators and we happen to be neuroscientists, and there's a convergence there. I love that because there's a kind of scientific integrity in that, and the language had to change for that to happen because when I was a graduate student, anything that you experienced was called subjectivity. And obviously, anything subjective was discarded as biased, which is understandable in some way, but in another way, it's like extremely limiting because what do we have other than experience? And even any scientific equipment is just an extension of our own senses. Whether it's a spectrophotometer or whether it's a telescope, they're just extensions of the senses. But from the Buddhist perspective, I mean, there are many more than 5 senses, intelligent capacities for, in some sense, decoding experience, awareness itself being one. So, again, I really feel that we're at a place where we need to invent a language that is appropriate to the multidimensionality of what we're trying to approach. And it may take, 100 years. I don't know. It may take more than one generation. But if we start inquiring in this way, it seems to me that, one, how many of you are psychologists by training? That you identify as a psychologist? Almost everybody. So psychology is the study of the self. So your question had to do with consciousness and awareness and presence and sentience. But what about the self? What is this psychology, the study of self? What's that? What is the self? So that is like, you hear these sounds? Who is hearing them? If you say I, it's just the personal pronoun, or me, but who's that? So again, from the point of view, if I believe that this convergence of science and Dharma has the potential to completely transform psychology. In the same way as, Santiago Ramon y Cajal and Golgi and all those other people, whether they were right or wrong about the particulars, gave us enough entry into the brain at that time that 100 years from now we can, interrogate it in ways that were completely unimaginable to them. Now, 100 years is just like 3 generations. So in the same way, I think that we now are in a position to ask very deep questions about the nature of the self, and whether, when we say self, we're not actually reifying something in speech that just the way we reify, like I, me, and mine, the personal pronouns. And this can be investigated in terms of like, what's behind that? What is this sentience? What is this presence? What is this knowing? What is this knowing of not knowing? If we ask the right questions. And that subjectivity, now we call it first-person experience. We've in some sense liberated ourselves from the prison of the shame of subjectivity, the bias inherent in subjectivity, and say, no, first-person experience is what it's all about. How do we see? We know how the eye works. George Wald, who won the Nobel Prize for color vision, he was a personal friend of mine. I spent decades talking to George Wald. So we know how color vision works, but we still don't know who's seeing. And George got very interested in that, and got very interested in meditation and yoga in his later years. And people thought he had gone crazy, but except me, I didn't think he'd gone crazy. So I don't know if that answers your question, but you know, I think you're pointing at something that really has to do with what I call languaging. And we can use that instrumentally to very good effect, even when writing our papers. How we actually understand our results and present them to our colleagues. We can present them in a very conventional way, or we might look at them in what I call orthogonally rotated ways, where everything's still the same, the conventional reality is still the conventional reality, but we have now extra dimensions that allow us to, in some sense, see relationships that we might not have seen before. And then have insights, aha experiences, eureka experiences, seeing things that have been here all the time, but because of the opaqueness of our lenses, our cognitive lenses, our conceptual lenses, and our emotional biases, we often don't. So really, and I say this a lot in my talks, you know, the best scientists on the planet have always doubted themselves. That you have to let go of everything you know in order to make the leap to what is right beyond the known that we want to get to. And some people say, well, some problems are not tractable because it's too big a leap. And that may be true for a particular time. You need the technology of a certain kind to be able to ask certain kinds of questions. But at the same time, I think it's really important to recognize that there are many different ways to ask questions, and the way we listen to what we really want to know can actually either blind us to what's right underneath our noses or reveal what might be maybe not right underneath our noses, but one experiment away from being right under our noses. Does this make any sense to you, what I'm saying? We're getting very philosophical. Don't you want to talk about some brain scans or something? Anyway, keep passing the microphone around. Let's...
Intentando responder un poco a tu pregunta de qué es lo que me ha traído aquí, pienso que es un sentido de pertenencia. Un sentido de pertenencia a un movimiento social, un movimiento que intenta desarrollar la conciencia individual para transformar la sociedad. Yo creo que eso está detrás de tu mensaje, está detrás probablemente de muchos otros mensajes actuales, es un momento importante en esta transformación. Y nosotros, hay aquí gente de diferentes instituciones que, viendo esta dificultad que existe entre el diálogo entre ciencia y espiritualidad, nos pusimos a trabajar para intentar que esto no fuera una discusión, sino que fuera algo colaborativo, que estamos aquí representando, ¿no? Varias instituciones que estamos haciendo investigación, por un lado, pero creemos en la necesidad de sostener también el Dharma como la cosmovisión que está permitiendo hacer esta apertura. Entonces es un sentido de pertenencia a un movimiento, ¿no? más que nada, ¿no? Probablemente exista parte de lo que es la mitomanía, ¿no? De conocer a la persona que crea este movimiento o que lo inicia, ¿no? O que en un momento dado inicia un movimiento que arrastra a otras personas, pero que ya estaba también implícito en la sociedad, ¿no? Es algo que yo creo que el mindfulness es algo que necesitaba esta sociedad contemporánea, ¿no? Y a pesar de las muchas resistencias que probablemente el mundo científico había puesto para introducir, ¿no? Este elemento en el proceso del desarrollo evolutivo humano, ha llegado el momento, ¿no? Y tú tuviste, digamos, esa especie de capacidad, de intuición, de aprovechamiento de este momento en el que pusiste esos dos elementos, ¿no? La ciencia y la espiritualidad, en armonía de alguna manera, ¿no? Y ahí es donde hemos ido todos intentando empujar este movimiento, ¿no? Y creo que es un movimiento que es importante porque todos tenemos cierta edad, bueno, lo que decía antes de los jóvenes igual menos, ¿no? Pero como decía alguien, hemos visto que casi todas las revoluciones llevan a que un grupo de facinerosos ocupen el sitio de un grupo de mafiosos, con lo cual no se consigue avanzar mucho, ¿no? Y hemos reconocido que la transformación viene de dentro y que esa transformación interna es la que tiene que impulsar, ¿no? La transformación de los venenos, como la avaricia, que hoy en día está tan presente en nuestro mundo político, ¿no? Pues esa transformación es la que necesita este mundo, ¿no? La transformación ética sobre todo, ¿no? Y entonces yo creo que esa sensación de pertenencia y sobre todo también esta presencia también es un signo, como también bien ha expresado Vicente, de agradecimiento, de complicidad, por no decirlo, pues también de un cierto cariño, de una cierta amor, ¿no? Que sale de nosotros por haber puesto en marcha esta rueda, ¿no? del Dharma, ¿no? Esta nueva rueda, ¿no? Porque yo, que ya sabes que vengo de la tradición Theravada, a mí lo de las ruedas no me va mucho, ¿eh? Lo de las ruedas del Dharma.
Yeah, let me just respond. Thank you for those kind sentiments. I'm glad you brought up the word ethics. You know, the Dharma is based on an ethical foundation, sila. In the same way, all of our work in MBSR, as far as I'm concerned, is based on an ethical foundation. In the United States, if you start talking about ethics and morality, people fall asleep in about 30 nanoseconds. So I felt like it was more important to have the ethical foundation be implicit rather than explicit, at least within the conduct of MBSR classes and so forth in the hospital, because the overarching ethic in medicine is the Hippocratic Oath. And the Hippocratic Oath is, one, put the patient first. So that means you have to be aware of how easily you could fall into your own ego interests in the success or failure of your treatments, or wanting to be liked by the patient, or all of these kinds of things that would actually be mini or not so mini forms of violence in the interaction between a caregiver and the person receiving the care. And the other thing is that the cardinal principle of the Hippocratic medicine is the Hippocratic tradition that goes back, you know, to Hippocrates. So that's a long, long time ago in the Greek world, not the Buddhist world, to first do no harm. And of course, how could you know whether you're doing any harm unless you're mindful, unless you're paying attention, unless you're bringing awareness to subtle cues that might have to do with body language, or the look that crosses somebody's face when you say something that is actually harmful or unconscious, and it hurts and it wounds and you don't notice it. So this is a profound element within our Western tradition, and it's good enough for me to sort of have MBSR be grounded in the Hippocratic tradition. On the other hand, you could say that from the Dharma side, it's also grounded in the Bodhisattva vow. What put the patient first means is like, well, that's the Bodhisattva vow. Everybody else has to be realized before I will take the final steps in my own realization. If you want to dualize it and make between you and me, or me and them. So the ethical foundation of this is deep and unwavering. When you speak about this as a movement, and I very much appreciate the sentiments that you're saying, and that we all, in some sense, want to feel like we're part of some larger whole. That's one of the most profoundly satisfying elements of being human, is that feeling that you refer to as belonging. It's like a hell realm to be isolated as a human being. And we need the heart connection. We need those kinds of things. That's our oxygen in a certain way. Shunning in tribal societies is like death, you know, ostracism is like cultural death. On the other hand, because you also use the word revolution, I believe, we need to be careful that we don't look to the outside like a bunch of true believers who are all like singing Kumbaya together and hoping for some kind of magical renaissance to happen where we're the leaders of some magical dharma spiritual conspiracy. And I think we need to be very, very careful about how we speak, how we look, and I don't mean just so that the appearance of it is skillful. I mean because we can fall into that kind of binary us and them very, very easily, and that would be the kiss of death in terms of what we most want, namely for this to move into the world in a way that transforms not just some people, but the entire species. And if we really take responsibility for some vision that is that big, then again, in terms of languaging and also in terms of our behavior, we have to be very careful that we don't wind up talking mindfulness and being not so mindful, talking compassion and being not so compassionate. And I see this as a major risk for all of us, and that we really need to keep that in the forefront of our consciousness. And the more successful we get, and the more press we get, and the more cameras that are in front of our faces, and the more people are interested in putting your research results in the New York Times Magazine section, the more you might get to feel like, yeah, I'm getting to be like a somebody, and that's, again, the kiss of death. So that's one of the reasons I stress that the meditation practice is life itself, including all of the complexities of being a scientist in this era and having to, you know, find money, get grants to do your research and all of that kind of stuff, and then to be successful enough so that you'll get promoted and be successful and get recognition and everything else. And if we're not in some sense able to hold all of that with a giant sense of humor and not take any of it personally, then we're going to look to the outside world like we're a kind of conspiracy of self-congratulatory self-interest, and that we're like a spiritual army that's going to tell everybody else how to be spiritual. You'll notice I never use the word spiritual. I think the word spirituality is not a skillful word to use in this day and age. Nobody knows what it means, but everybody thinks that their particular spirituality is better than everybody else's spirituality. I'm beginning to use the word dharma more and more for the past 10 or 20 years, but earlier I would never use the word dharma because I didn't want people to think I was secretly trying to turn people into Buddhists. Now it's the Buddhists that are, one, criticizing me a good deal for taking the dharma away from its ethical roots, and they are also criticizing me for well, they're not criticizing me, they're actually, I don't know whether it's praise or whether it's blame, but whatever it is, they're calling it, what I do, stealth Buddhism. And that, for me, is a disaster, because it suggests that my motivation is to turn every poor person who is suffering, who comes to our hospital or clinic, secretly into a Buddha without telling them, without self-disclosure. So that would be a form of violence and ignorance and you know, just unethical behavior. And it's Buddhists who think that. And I'm going, there's something wrong with this picture. I mean, we've never had the Dharma at the verge of being understood, accepted, and enacted, embodied in practice in the world stoichiometrically in the way that is now possible. And why should we start criticizing each other about the, you know, sort of elements that are really based on ignorance of what, say, we're trying to do in the first place? So it's a very interesting time, but if we start to say, well, they're on the team and they're not on the team, I'm not sure what team we're even talking about. So thank you. I loved what you said, but that, you know. Gonzalo.
Voy a hablar en castellano porque mi inglés es asturiano. Me siento muy agradecido por estar aquí con todos y todas vosotras, con Jon, con Javier, gracias también. Es una oportunidad única porque no muchas veces nos reunimos, ¿no? Y quería entrar un poco de lleno o más de lleno, rozando en lo que es investigación. Y me parece que hay muchos tipos de investigación que de alguna manera pretenden valorar si un protocolo es o no adecuado para para una población, un contexto o lo que fuera, viendo cambios significativos antes y después de hacerlo, ¿no? Y valorando ciertas variables, y me parece que es precioso. A mí me interesa más los mecanismos de mindfulness, pero con una intención que tengo por detrás que no sé si es errada, y por eso quería hacer una pregunta a todos, evidentemente a Jon, aprovechando que estás aquí, y es si de alguna manera entender los mecanismos nos va a permitir tener mayor habilidad para incrementar nuestras capacidades meditativas. Si la ciencia, en ese sentido, la investigación, por ejemplo, en psicobiología de la meditación, nos permitiría avanzar personalmente en la meditación o no. Y si es así, ¿qué pasos habría que dar? Sé que es una pregunta a futuro, una pregunta muy amplia. ¿Qué pasos podríamos dar? ¿Cuál es el siguiente paso que estamos llamados a dar en el sentido de la investigación para poder saber más acerca de los mecanismos de la meditación y de esa manera quizás poder avanzar más en la experiencia propia?
What comes to mind is, a lot of things come to mind, but one is the work of my colleague Judd Brewer, who's now the Director of Research at the Center for Mindfulness at the University of Massachusetts Medical Center, and who was at Yale for a number of years before that, who's looking at the posterior cingulate cortex in particular, and real-time neurofeedback, both fMRI and also EEG feedback. I'm sure you're all familiar with those studies where you can actually watch what goes on in the mind on the screen when you are trying to achieve or attain a particular kind of state of mind. And when you let go or get out of your own way, you can see the difference, and you can maybe learn to feel the difference in your body and then maintain, as you know, people with years and years or decades of meditation experience, they go in there and they just, not to go into the details, red above the line is basically thinking and attached to a particular kind of striving for an endpoint, and blue below the line is resting in, you know, open spaciousness with no striving, no place to go, nothing to do. Well, that's easy to say in meditative instruction, but it's not so easy for a new, you know, somebody new to meditation to like, what am I supposed to be feeling? What am I supposed to be doing? So if there were instrumental ways to actually train that particular domain in the brain to understand first-person felt open spaciousness, well, that might be, you know, might save years. On the other hand, of training or hard meditative practice in monasteries or whatever. But on the other hand, you know, that would also have to be researched, because you don't know if without the years of cultivation that those kinds of experiences would actually be understood or embodied in ways that would translate into wisdom, or translate into compassion, or translate into, you know, a fully embodied life. So I think the question of mechanism, and, you know, there's also this element of, it's not just neural feedback of the PCC, but as I mentioned in the talk last night, there's enhanced functional connectivity between the PFC and the PCC. So, you know, we're actually in terms of mechanisms, people are now showing very short-term effects from like almost no training at all, like 20 minutes 4 times or something like that. Major changes that lead to increased laying down of functional, connectivity in the tracks in the brain or networks. We don't know how transient they are or how instantiated over time they are, but these are like really tractable questions that it makes a lot of sense to ask and investigate, because one of the biggest problems, and one of the ones that His Holiness and many of the Tibetans emphasize an awful lot, has to do with afflictive emotions. And of course, when we get stressed, the first thing that happens to us is we lose our minds. And what does that mean actually? In some sense, it means that the prefrontal cortex just goes offline. It just shuts down, and then you have the amygdala and the hippocampus, in some sense, or whatever it is, those networks, or for that matter, the default mode network, just going a little bit crazy, and then it's autocatalytic, so it goes from bad to worse. So I think there actually are not only tractable questions, but we're beginning to lay down a certain kind of topology of understanding of, if you will, mechanisms of mindfulness, and people are writing papers about it. Dave Vago and others at Harvard and in Germany are writing papers about like how there are elements of attention regulation that are involved, and networks of attention regulation, networks of emotion regulation that are involved, and networks of salience that are involved, and there are all sorts of regions of the brain that we think are involved in salience to one. So again, I mean, it's like, that's why I keep saying this is in some sense like a kind of Renaissance moment, because no one's been able to ever ask those questions before, and without the mindfulness or the meditative compassion, the whole spectrum of meditative practices, the neuroscientists on their own might invent very clever cognitive kind of studies, but they probably would never come to silence, to stillness, to wakefulness, to heartfulness on their own. And so there's a win-win situation where the wisdom of thousands of years of a kind of accumulated, scientifically distilled first-person wisdom is meeting this stream of, technological, sort of empirical, scientific inquiry, and the potential benefits are huge. And also, as usual with science, there's a potential risk of arrogance that goes along with it, and that we understand what the most important questions are, we know how to approach them and everything else, and that itself needs to become an object of meditative attention. So just to say, I know it's a little bit difficult because we have 2 languages going here, and I wish that I spoke Spanish, but just to say, in case you don't detect it because of the subtlety of the language, I'm trying to be a bit provocative in the way I'm speaking, because I really want to not piss you off, but get you to really respond to some of the hard problems that we face in order to really create a science that is worthy of the Dharma. And it would have to be synthetic, not just analytical. It would have to sort of be something that embraces multiple dimensions of understanding and wholeness, some of which would approach, neurophenomenology and, the hard problems of the nature of self or the nature of consciousness. It's like, if you're young and you're, trained in science, you're working in your group or whatever, this is what I would call a to die for moment in the history of the planet. And, you could say, and I do a lot, that the world is actually dying for this convergence to flower. Because we are really stupid in a certain way, this species that we've named Homo sapiens sapiens. I sometimes think of us as the autoimmune disease of the planet. Did you get that in the translation? The autoimmune disease of the planet, in the sense that we are the agent of the dis-ease, and we are also the first victim of our own agency. Okay? And we did call ourselves Homo sapiens sapiens, which means, as you know better than I from the Latin, sapere, which means to taste or to know, not conceptual knowing, but a direct first-person experience type knowing, but doesn't completely discard the conceptual. It's not saying that concepts or thinking are bad, but it's just not the whole story. Well, if we're the species that knows and knows that it knows, then it's not sort of cognition and metacognition. It's awareness and meta-awareness. And I would say that time is short because we're so precocious, because we have atomic weapons, because we're out of our minds, because we have such wildly unequal distributions of resources on a planetary scale, because we're still living in a tribal brain in many ways. We have the potential to do enormous harm. We will not annihilate life as we know it on the planet. The cockroaches will probably do fine with enormous amounts of radioactivity, no water, and a very, very hot planet. But I don't know how our grandchildren are going to do, or great-grandchildren. And so there's a certain way in which this convergence of science and Dharma, it's not just so that I'll have a nice little clinical experience of my headaches going away, or even my blood pressure, or even my T cells being, you know, sort of more highly tuned. It's a matter of life and death for us. And so again, that carries a certain amount of human responsibility that I think when it's distributive and we each take it seriously as me, myself, not as some caricature of myself, then the conditions for a kind of profound creativity, both in science and in humanism and in politics and in economics and in every other way, might actually still be in time to address some of the huge transmigrations of people that we're seeing on this planet and that you're feeling in Europe. The melting of the polar ice caps and the glaciers in Switzerland and Greenland and everywhere else. I mean, this is like, you know, the clock is ticking in a certain way, and we would be fools not to own the name we've given ourselves as a species, Homo sapiens sapiens, and realize it. In other words, make it real. And that kind of realization is a moment by moment by moment realization. And that's why the practice of mindfulness is not some kind of optional thing for us at this point on the planet in the history of humanity. It's like the core curriculum, if you will. And there's no one way to do it. So it's not like we're talking about genuflecting to some catechism. No, we're not. So I think the stakes are incredibly high, and that's one of the reasons that I am so incredibly moved that we're even having this conversation. I mean, I didn't know why I'm coming to Zaragoza. I mean, some of you I've known or seen in here or there, but I haven't even grasped myself how profound the sort of birth or spread or incubation of mindfulness in Spain really has gotten in the past. I don't even know when to start measuring it from, but I don't think 10 years ago. It was like, you're the only person, I think we met in 2005 in Washington, D.C. Is that right? At the Mind and Life conference that Richie Davidson and I were the scientific directors of. Yeah, and like the only person I'd ever heard of in Spain interested in mindfulness, aside from, of course, Fernando, who was working with me. And the reason I'm here is because of Fernando. But to tell you the truth, Fernando's been trying to get me to come to Spain for years. And I was like, oh, Spain, why should I go to Spain? You know, it's like, and it's like, I cannot believe the level of my delusion and ignorance. I mean, it's like the feeling that I've had since I've landed here, not very long ago, is like, This is like way better than what's going on in the United States, maybe in some way or other, or in a lot of other countries. What I'm saying is I'm not comparing one to the other. What I'm saying is I feel a certain kind of love, passion, kindness, and a sort of, I don't know, I don't want to reify, you know, some kind of, let me just say, it just feels really good to be here and to see and feel how committed you are as professionals in science and psychology and neuroscience and so forth, to inquiring deeply about these kinds of questions and what the kind of immediate consequence, practical consequences are for addressing the major issues of greed, hatred, delusion, and suffering that we are facing in this country, in all of our countries, and you know, as a species. What could be more fun than that? Now, you know, we keep moving into these bigger things, and I would like to actually show you some PowerPoint slides, if you like, you know, of like real studies. Or is that too boring for you? You know, it's like, I don't think I can, I don't know if I can even hook my computer up quickly enough to do it. But I would like at some point to at least tell you about a couple of studies that I'm really excited about. But I want to hear about your studies. I want to know what you're looking at. I want to hear from you, Perla, and from, you know, whoever wants to really tell us or tell me what's exciting to you. Because I get bored very quickly from hearing myself speak, you know.
Sí, ahora. Yo soy Beatriz Rodríguez Vega y trabajo en Hospital La Paz como psiquiatra y soy profesora de la Universidad Autónoma. Y mi interés y lo que quería plantear como tema de investigación es efectivamente con la pregunta de Gustavo sobre los mecanismos y sobre la idealización que se hace a veces de que conocer cómo se ilumina el cerebro en ciertas áreas, a veces se produce como una reducción del ser humano a esas áreas que se mapean, ¿no? y de la experiencia del ser humano. Entonces, mi pregunta va en el sentido de que como psicoterapeuta mi interés es la integración de mindfulness en la psicoterapia y el traer la experiencia subjetiva como una forma complementaria a la investigación cualitativa, como algo complementario a la investigación más dura de la neurociencia. ¿Cuál es la experiencia que hay detrás de esa iluminación de áreas cerebrales, ¿no? Y también investigación sobre el lenguaje, sobre cómo cada vez que hablamos nos equivocamos, troceamos la experiencia como si fuera posible partirla. El lenguaje en sí mismo siempre nos va a llevar a una equivocación. Entonces, ¿cómo hacer para observar y transformar el lenguaje con la atención plena? Algo de esto, ¿no?
Well, I don't want to talk too much, so I'll just respond to that very briefly. Start being mindful of what comes out of our mouths and how it does and how it has an effect on other people. And that can be actually a major meditative practice in its own right. And I try to practice that, and I find it incredibly beneficial because we can fall into patterns of thought which sound like they're really conscious, but they're actually totally on autopilot. So it requires almost like using our words like a musician might be crafting and playing music simultaneously. Okay, note by note by note by note, and understanding the harmonies and the dissonances and the pacing and all sorts of things that one person, we use when we wag our tongues and move our mouths to influence the physiology and the deep understanding of another person, including emotionally.
Thank you very much for your interest in our research. Well, I'm really so moved to be here today. For me, it's a dream to be here with a lot of researchers interested in mindfulness and consciousness. And I'm a molecular biologist. I'm not a psychologist, but I have been studying for almost 10 years now the molecular effects of meditation on the cells, on the genes, on epigenetics. And my interest came from my own experience practicing yoga and meditation, feeling how these kind of practices are so powerful. And I was sure that there were many things happening at the very deep level of the genes because I was feeling it.
Yeah.
So as a biochemist, I was interested in knowing what was happening.
Wonderful.
And also because I'm really convinced that we have to put all our efforts on prevention of disease.
We have to what?
To put a lot of effort on prevention of diseases and not on only on treatment. And I have always been working on disease, and I really wanted to work on health. So this is how I started my collaboration with Richard Davidson and Antoine Lutz, and to study the epigenetic effects of meditation, to see if the meditation practice could leave marks on DNA and on switching on and off genes and affecting like general mechanisms like inflammation, which are at the basis of most chronic diseases. And we were the most surprised to see changes at the histone levels after just 8 hours of practices in expert meditators. And we are now continuing these studies on methylation of DNA. And also I'm collaborating now with in the Shamatha project with Cliff Saron, studying the gene expression changes on the telomerase and telomere pathway. And a very beautiful project now, a European project. We got a grant from the community, European community, from the Horizon 2020 to study the effects of meditation on healthy aging. So I'm collaborating in the work package of biomarkers, and this is extremely beautiful, and I hope we will get good results to help the aging of the population. Now there are more than 35 million people with Alzheimer's, and we are expecting more than 100 million people with Alzheimer's in 30 years. So this is extremely important. And John, you are on the board of external scientific board of this project, and this is also wonderful. Thank you for that. And well, this is more or less what I'm doing. I'm also very interested in the effect of mindful eating for healthy aging, working with chefs to bring it to real life. And this is also, for me, very, very exciting.
Yeah. Well, I'm just thrilled that you're doing that. And it's really interesting that, in terms of your question, Gonzalo, that, I'm sorry, Gustavo, thank you. It's really interesting that science has changed so much that we now have a science of epigenetics. It used to not even be known that, you know, the genome was that plastic. You know, it wasn't known that the brain was, the nervous system was plastic, and now we know everything's plastic. I mean, it's like, and how, and our consciousness actually influences it, our, states of mind, if you want to call it that. And that people are now, so, we did MBSR for 8 weeks because we're developing a clinical program, and it takes time to teach people how to meditate. Because the whole purpose was to catch people who are with every conceivable chronic medical disorder, who are not being satisfied by their medical treatments, not receiving full satisfaction, and challenging them to do something for themselves that no one else could do for them. And we felt like, well, it's got to have some kind of time sequence so that you actually get enough meditative practice under your belt so that in 8 weeks you could do it for the rest of your life and have at least a firm foundation. But now people are doing 1 day of meditation practice with people who've never had any meditative experience and finding those kinds of epigenetic changes. That's wild.
No, this was in expert meditators.
I'm sorry?
Expert meditators.
Oh, it's expert meditators that you were doing.
Like, yeah.
But other people are actually doing just short things, and I don't even know how I feel about it, but they're finding very interesting things, like Fadel Zaidan, for instance, at Wake Forest University, who's been studying pain pathways, and training people in like 4 20-minute sessions to meditate or to relax, where it's like your relaxation, just tell people to relax or whatever, but don't teach them anything about it, and give them some rudimentary mindfulness instruction. And then he finds that the meditators actually are capable of dealing with 49 degrees centigrade heat block pain in a way that dramatically reduces their reports of pain, intensity, and so forth, and that naloxone doesn't influence that at all, so that it's not an opioid-mediated mechanism. So Gustavo, yeah, that's. I'm sorry, I'm just like been talking straight for like almost 2 weeks. So every once in a while, my PFC goes off. In very short periods of time, you can actually learn practices that the mechanism is not a naloxone, sort of opioid-mediated pain reduction. So that's like, sort of interesting information. And it does not work in the non-meditating control group. To the extent that they have pain reduction, it's naloxone, sensitive. And another study that comes to mind that was actually featured in the New York Times magazine, Sunday magazine, not that long ago, was David Creswell's study looking at, and both of these are published in 2016, so, sort of very recent studies, looking at, they took unemployed people, I love this, they took unemployed men and women and gave them, I think, a 3-day retreat of mindfulness, and looked at the sort of connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and the PCC, and they found that in this 3-day retreat, that people were actually increasing connectivity in the meditative condition and not in the control condition. I mean, to me, these are incredibly exciting results that indicate pathways of plasticity that actually transform underlying emotion regulation, attention regulation in ways that definitely are going to influence health, lifestyle, all sorts of things like that. So I don't think there's ever been a better time to be a scientist investigating these kinds of things because of the plasticity issue, the neuroplasticity, the epigenetics, and the telomeres alone, to say nothing about the connectivity studies. the technology has reached a point, and it will probably keep getting better and better, where we can like really look in almost real time, as with the neurofeedback stuff, and see what's going on. But the fact that the genome is sensitive, and in the domain of inflammatory and inflammatory genes and proto-oncogenes and so forth, this has deep, deep implications. And I would like to see some of it. You know, I did this study 20 years ago with people with psoriasis, showing that if they're meditating while they're receiving ultraviolet light, their skin clears at 4 times the rate of people who are just getting the ultraviolet light itself. And in one way or another, that has to go all the way down to the level of gene expression, because psoriasis is an uncontrolled cell proliferation. And so gene expression, cell division, this really could be investigated as a kind of ideal model system for understanding the mind-body connection and how it influences health. It also has, you know, practical implications, because if you could engage people with psoriasis in using their minds while they're receiving whatever treatment they're receiving and need fewer treatments, well, the ultraviolet light is actually itself a risk factor for basal cell carcinoma. So there's all sorts of potential synergies that could be translated into healthcare in no time at all.
Okay. Well, first I would do say it feels great to be here among so many people who work on mindfulness. I have to say I'm a newbie when it comes to meditation or mindfulness. My background is cognitive psychology of attention, and so I'd love to tell you what research I've been doing on mindfulness, but the truth is I haven't actually started yet. And so that's the reason why I'm here. It's to try to get some hints, or maybe to see what your thoughts are on some particular issues, and to rebound on some of the things you mentioned about effects we see through meditation even after very short times of practice. Obviously when I read the literature, there's a lot about meditation. Some studies about interventions, sometimes very short, but I'd like to pick your brains on the concept that we haven't talked about so far, and that's the concept of dispositional mindfulness, as it's sometimes called. So, which is measured through questionnaires, there's a variety of questionnaires, and where, you know, studies also find differences, interesting differences in all kinds of areas. And I'd like to ask what your thoughts are on that. Is this type of mindfulness the same kind of mindfulness we're talking about in the case of people who practice? Are people who are highly mindful, you know, without a practice of meditation? Have they been meditating without knowing? You know, what is it in the meditation that increases their level of mindfulness as it's measured by some of these instruments? Yeah. I'm just trying to get some bearings on, you know, what is this dispositional mindfulness?
I'm not an expert in that field, and I'm not an expert in self-report questionnaires. I do believe that there are major problems with all of those mindfulness scales. Paul Grossman certainly is quite vociferous on that subject, if you've read him, and Van Damme and others, including Richie Davidson, you know, that they are limited. And the other thing is that even what is mindfulness? Are we talking about the same mindfulness in someone who's had 8 weeks of mindfulness training and 8 years of mindfulness practice? I mean, so how would you answer those questionnaires if you're like a different person after 8 years of practice, or after 50 years of practice? So the questions might be the same, but the answers might be completely biased by who's answering and what their sort of local historical trajectory has been. So you know, the fact that there are studies that show that if you look at dispositional mindfulness in, say, people who have 8 weeks of MBSR, say, they have a certain level. If you take people who are monastics and they've practiced for 50, 60,000 hours, they have a higher level of mindfulness. And if you take undergraduates who are binge drinkers on the weekend and measure their mindfulness, it exceeds the monastics. So there's got to be something there, that maybe these scales are measuring something, but maybe it's not mindfulness. And then people use mindfulness in a lot of different ways. So, for instance, in DBT, if you know anything about dialectical behavior therapy, and I don't know that much, and I'm not making any kind of critical assertions about anything. But, you know, those are skillful means for offering training programs to people who want to kill themselves every 15 minutes. And so there's a certain language that's developed to behaviorally oriented, because Marshall Linehan is like, professes all the time that she's a behaviorist in certain ways, a behavioral, you know, cognitive behavioral scientist. So these things are particularly useful and skillful in certain populations, but they may not be generalizable in the sense that describe. I mean, that never doesn't resonate with me. I describe my experience or observe or any of that kind of stuff. They're in some sense, and again, I know I'm being filmed, and I'm probably going to be, I don't know if I'm going to be on the internet sounding like a big expert in all of these kind of psychometric, you know, measures, and I'm not. So I want to sort of like be very clear about that. But my own sense of it is I don't understand what those dispositional things are. And of course, then they are correlated with certain kinds of harder evidence, you know, sort of neuroscience evidence or clinical evidence and so forth. So there's something there, but what that something is, I don't know. And I think it's really important to not necessarily think that just because we're calling them mindfulness scales, that they're actually measuring what we mean when we say mindfulness. And I think that maybe we don't know what we mean when we use the word mindfulness, or maybe different people are using the word very differently, or even the same person is using it very differently depending on, you know, the context. And there's some virtue in that, and there's, of course, from a scientific point of view, that could be endlessly confusing. But let's not forget that even Hans Selye, you know, I mean, the word stress, you know, for a long time, it was like, oh, stress, you know, it's like not a scientific concept, because it's never clear in the language whether we're talking about the stimulus or we're talking about the response. So then he coined the term stressor, but I don't know if that solved the problem. But we have those kinds of issues as well, and I think that over the next 30 or 40 years, by the kinds of studies that you and others will be doing, presumably, we'll get more clarity on that subject. I think it's wonderful if you are an attention researcher, that you're bringing your attention to this whole domain of mindfulness, because, you know, I mean, I don't know anything about the attention literature, but I know there is a big attention literature, and again, it's like interfaces with the deep question of how does attention relate to awareness? So what is awareness? How does it manifest biologically? And also, you mentioned it, there's the whole social dimension of awareness. Like, maybe is awareness even localized to one body, or is there some way in which we're sharing a space, just like maybe mirror neurons or empathy, or, you know, sort of, these are profound questions of, like, is a human being actually encased in a skin, or are we in some sense mirroring each other constantly, which we're doing just by wagging tongues and using our ears and languaging. So we're very, very complex social beings, and I think all of this, in some sense, is deserving of a certain kind of larger but highly rigorous scientific investigation.
La pregunta me ha surgido porque he leído recientemente un artículo publicado en Psychological Bulletin sobre que han descubierto una diferencia genética en personas que se someten de forma aleatoria a un experimento de emociones positivas, y parece ser que hay un perfil de personas que tendrían como cierta ventaja de experimentar ese tipo de emociones positivas. Diría que se vería enriquecida, ¿no?, su experiencia, y se pudo ver a nivel genético, mientras que hay otras personas que incluso muestran resistencia. Claro, a mí esto me ha hecho pensar, y me gustaría conocer a través de tu experiencia, sobre todo clínica, ¿no?, tu observación, tu propia experiencia desde tantos años, si crees que pueda existir también una diferente aprovechamiento del entrenamiento en mindfulness cuando haces una asignación aleatoria y controlamos, pues, variables que podamos un poco pensar, ¿no?, como que de base tenga flexibilidad cognitiva la persona, o que de base tenga una buena regulación emocional, ¿no? Si eso aleatorizamos, ¿crees que pueda...?
She's having a hard time understanding you. You're speaking too fast.
Ah, perdón.
Fatal. She's telling me that she's not understanding.
Horrible in English and even worse in Spanish, okay. Sorry for that.
Could you speak a little slower?
Okay.
Because you're asking a very technical question, actually,
Yeah.
and the translator the interpreter doesn't have the scientific background to actually.
Okay, so let me know where you stop, and I can go from there.
I don't know where that is. Go back 2 sentences and start again.
Oh my gosh.
I was getting it. You know, I was really getting what you were saying.
Yeah.
And she was too, until, positive experiences will predispose people in a certain way that might have epigenetic effects, right?
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying? And neutral experiences would not have that same effect. And
Yeah.
maybe some people are more open to that kind of thing than other people. Is that true?
Yeah,
Okay,
that's it.
start there.
Thank you. Okay. Sigo en español quizá mejor y hablando más despacio. Lo siento otra vez.
Y breve, a ser posible, porque tenemos poco tiempo.
Sí, la pregunta es muy rápida. Era, este estudio me ha hecho pensar, que es un estudio que no han hecho nada de mindfulness, solo emociones positivas. Pero ese estudio me ha hecho pensar si crees, con tu experiencia clínica, que pueda existir un aprovechamiento diferente según las personas, habiendo aleatorizado condiciones como flexibilidad cognitiva, cognitive flexibility, regulación emocional y cuestiones similares. Esa es mi pregunta, que era breve, pero no he conseguido hacerla breve.
It's a wonderful question. It's a wonderful, wonderful question, and I'm really glad you asked it, and I'm really glad we got to understand it, at least a little bit. So, again, this is, I think, an area where there be potentially wonderful studies. But when it comes to attention, or whether it comes to learning, or emotion, motivation, or anything like that, you don't have to be some kind of genius to recognize that you can set up anything to succeed or fail in a population of people. And, you know, if you make it terminally boring to people from the very beginning, I mean, even if you're teaching something interesting like molecular biology or organic chemistry, you know, everybody will fall asleep. Okay? Or you can make it so interesting that no one will fall asleep. That has to do with how you understand those social and cognitive and emotional and somatic dimensions of the teaching, learning sort of environment. So, you know, I've known, you know, from the very beginning that you could take MBSR and set it up so that it will fail completely. Or you can take the same curriculum and breathe life into it. How you do it really depends on who you're dealing with, circumstances, and so forth. But one of the things that I find is kind of universally appropriate, universally recognized, is I'm not sure exactly how to put this into words, but to actually recognize verbally, but mostly non-verbally, the humanity of the other. So that they feel it, but you're not doing it so that they feel it in a contrived, artificial way. In other words, being real. And then whatever the curriculum is, or whatever the program is that you're hoping to introduce to them, do it in a way that really ignites passion in others for the ongoing investigation of the dimensionality of their own lives and possibilities. And that's an art form. And it can be developed. And the more in psychological treatments that art form is developed, especially in group situations, if we're talking about training people in mindfulness, that you have to care, and you have to be unattached to outcome. And especially if you're teaching non-dualistic meditative practices. And if you're not teaching mindfulness in a way that's non-dual, then you're not teaching what I mean by mindfulness. So these are huge challenges. And whether you want to call it the placebo effect or you want to sort of make it much more elaborate, creating an environment in which everybody feels seen, met, and acknowledged, and also recognized as being already whole, even if they feel broken, gives people a sense of possibility that they can do a certain kind of interior work, or at least it looks like work, but turns out to be more like love, or a love affair, or play, and as an experiment, not to get a result, but to see what would happen if you aligned yourself with what's deepest and best in your human nature. So I think there are an infinite number of ways to do that, but there, just as there are different sizes of infinity, there are a much larger number of infinite ways to screw it up. Okay?
Sí, no hay tiempo para más. Vamos a hacer una foto final todos, pero sí que me gustaría que nos dejases un consejo final, Jon.
We have to catch a train.
Yeah. Un consejo final. ¿Qué habría que investigar, qué nos recomiendas investigar en Mindfulness y Compasión? 1, y 2, en relación con la tradición, ¿qué piensas que sería útil investigar y que sea útil para la sociedad?
A final tip.
Final advice.
I think perhaps what would be most valuable in this moment is for us to all drop into that question in silence. And recognize that this is, in some sense, a distributive responsibility, and that we all need to be asking ourselves that question. This is not my clever way of weaseling out of giving you an answer, but to suggest that it's so deep a question that we really need to incubate it in our own hearts and not come up with some facile dime store way of, directing things. I think our whole conversation, at least it's my hope, and I want to express it explicitly, our whole conversation has really been an inquiry into your question. Excuse me. And so rather than having some final tip that, the only thing I could recommend when all is said and done is that as scientists, we not forget that we're human beings first, that we live full lives, and that our intelligences are multiple. The body has its own intelligence, the genome has its own intelligence, that the social domain has its own intelligences, multiple. The language has its own intelligences, multiple. Our senses have their own, and their, proprioception, interoception, not just the 5 conventional senses, awareness itself. And so the more we actually see our science and our meditation practice as a seamless, and our lives as a seamless, multidimensional phase space in which all sorts of emergences are possible. And each one of us, in some sense, is embodied to a unique precipitating of wakefulness in the form of the personal pronouns I, me, and mine, but that are not limited to me. The more we're going to take care of the science and take care of the world in a way that will be consistent. So I want to thank you for your attention. Sorry I have to run to catch a train, but I just love that we've had this conversation. It's just very beautiful, and I bow deeply to each and every one of you for what you're doing and for the love of it and for the hard work as well, on the side of your own practice and on the side of how hard it is to do good science. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.